Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Escalante's Dream, On the Trail of the Spanish Discovery of the Southwest, by David Roberts. Read by Robert Fass. Chapter 1. Abiquiu and Beyond. The three-quarter moon had crept into the west when my nightmare arrived. It was September 2nd, 2017. That morning, my wife Sharon and I had left Santa Fe on what promised to be a 6-week journey, following the fugitive trail of the 12-man expedition that had passed this way 241 years before. Our voyage was one that would have seemed almost tame to me throughout my adult life, until 2 years earlier, when cancer had abruptly redefined all my notions of the possible. Now I knew that our 40 days in pursuit of Domínguez and Escalante posed as stern a challenge as I dared to engage. We had driven north on Highway 84, through the crossroads town of Española along the Chama River, arriving after some 45 miles at the sleepy village of Abiquiu, famed for Georgia O'Keeffe's obsession with cow skulls, local flowers, and the old mission church. From there, we headed south on a dirt road that climbed out of a tight canyon to emerge on a glorious grassy plateau, land still held by the descendants of the benefactors of an old Spanish land grant. After some 10 miles, we had crossed into the Santa Fe National Forest. Around 5 p.m., we found the perfect roadside campsite at 8,000 feet under the soaring ponderosas, with open views east to a far rim of the forest and west to Cerro Pedernal, the volcanic mountain from which the ancients had extracted chert and obsidian to craft their dart points and arrowheads. We set up our tent, gathered sticks for a fire, and sat in our $10 Walmart camp chairs sipping Pilsner Urquells as the sun slipped toward the horizon. I was as happy as I had been in months. It was Saturday night. The previous evening, an old friend who lives in Santa Fe, on learning about our plans, had warned us that Española was the center of opioid and alcohol excess in northern New Mexico. As she wished us well, she parted with that timeless admonition, "Be careful." I was inclined to dismiss our friend's malaise, recognizing in it, along with statistical accuracy, an ancient bias against Hispanic lifeways promulgated by the Anglos who ran New Mexico after 1848. But Sharon was troubled. Unable to sleep during our last night in Santa Fe, she got up and Googled Española opioids crime on her iPhone. I slept on, oblivious. In the morning, she haltingly shared her worries. I pointed out that we would pass through Española in the afternoon, and that wherever we car camped, it would be well beyond the range of the region's most malevolent junkies. Since we had set up camp, only a single vehicle had passed by on the dirt road, a pickup headed at dusk, I guessed, for home or some other civilized refuge. But paradoxically, when almost no cars pass your campsite, the advent of a single one, announced by distant engine noise, then by the beams of headlights bouncing among the trees, seems faintly ominous. I had unconsciously absorbed Sharon's fears. In the night, a dream delivered a black SUV that stopped just yards away from our tent. Instead of hiding or fleeing, I got up to greet the strangers. Several bearded men wearing camo stepped out of the vehicle. They carried their guns nonchalantly in their hands or slung across their backs. One of them surveyed our campsite. "We just need something to eat," he said. "But is it deer season?" I asked. "No." I fought down a thread of panic. "I've camped out," I said, "for 60 years now." "Not much left then, is there?" The sun rose at its appointed hour over the far rim in the east. Bundled against the cold, I put a pot of water on our 2-burner stove to heat for coffee. Slowly, the pallor of the nightmare dissolved, but I didn't tell Sharon about the visitation in the night until the next day. To echo Macaulay, Every schoolboy knows about the journey across the continent launched by Lewis and Clark in 1804, as the Corps of Discovery fulfilled Thomas Jefferson's mandate to learn just what kind of territory the United States had bought from France the preceding year. 28 years before Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis, a pair of Franciscan priests led a much smaller cadre of men on a monumental exploration through some of the most spectacular and difficult terrain in the future United States, in the process actually discovering more land unknown to non-natives than Lewis and Clark did. Yet not even Macaulay's brightest pupil today has more than the haziest grasp of the extraordinary journey led by Domínguez and Escalante in 1776. The journals kept by Lewis and Clark are disjointed, preoccupied with minutiae, and myopic about the shape of the great voyage, and Clark's command of spelling, grammar, and punctuation is so shaky that his passages often verge on the illiterate. America's most famous expedition of discovery is best absorbed today via such excellent second-hand narratives as Bernard DeVoto's The Course of Empire or Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage. But Escalante's journal, coherent, succinct, yet full of curious asides and observations, is far more readable than any of the several commentaries about the Spaniard's journey written by latter-day historians. In the words of DeVoto, the journal is a poem, dramatized against the backdrop of the rock deserts. The expedition itself, despite its harrowing tribulations and a life-or-death denouement, seemed to DeVoto a sunnily stupendous journey. What's more, the team's cartographer, Bernardo Miera y Pacheco, drew an extraordinary map that is an artistic masterpiece in its own right. It remained the best chart of the greater Southwest until the middle of the 19th century. In 1951, Herbert E. Bolton became the first historian to engage Domínguez and Escalante at book length. About the Padres as explorers, he wrote, "For the opening of new vistas, they belong with Coronado and the splendid wayfarers of Mexico and South America. For their relations with the strange peoples encountered, they stand in a class almost by themselves." No book yet written about the Domínguez-Escalante journey has gone beyond a paraphrase of the journal and a summary of the expedition's results. My intention in Escalante's Dream is to cross-examine the Padre's account at every turn, to wonder what was going on whenever the explorers made a strange decision or engaged in a puzzling interaction with Native Americans met along the way, and to dig below the surface of the conflicts among and characters of the 12 men on the team. And as Sharon and I retrace the 1776 journey through 40 days in the fall of 2017, I intend to treat our own adventure as a parallel expedition 241 years later, a road trip through a world Domínguez and Escalante could never have foreseen. Silvestre Vélez de Escalante was born in 1749 in Cantabria, a green, hilly province in northern Spain. He was a montañés, a Highlander, and had he stayed in his native land, he might well have whiled away his years as a shepherd or a farmer. We know very little about the man's early life, but by the late 1760s he had arrived in Mexico City. There, at only 18, he became a friar in the Order of St. Francis of Assisi. From 1598 onward, it had been Franciscans who took charge of the religious life of New Spain's northernmost colony, and their highest duty and keenest passion had to do with bringing the salvation of the Redeemer into the hearts and souls of the benighted natives the Spaniards found when they arrived. Escalante was second in command of the bold expedition on which he embarked in July 1776, the same month that 56 ardent rebels convened in a hall in Philadelphia to sign a ringing declaration of their freedom from the tyranny of King George III. We know as little about the expedition's commander, another friar named Francisco Atanasio Domínguez, as we do about Escalante. But because it was the latter man who wrote the official journal, virtually the sole primary document from the adventure to come down to us, we have something like a direct pipeline to the thoughts and feelings of the exploit's junior leader. As many commentators have pointed out, we should refer to Domínguez's lieutenant not as Escalante but as Vélez, since the de Escalante of his name merely identified where he was from, as in Shakespeare's John of Gaunt. Likewise, of course, with Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. But calling the conquistador who led the first great exploration of what would become the American Southwest Vázquez would simply be confusing. The name Escalante, like that of Coronado, has been attached to all kinds of places in the Southwest, and to insist on Vélez here would be to err on the side of pedantry. As Sharon and I retraced the route of the long-ago journey, and read and reread the entries that dealt with each stage of the voyage, I often wondered what kind of role fear had played in the men's lives. Because the expedition turned into a survival ordeal, reducing the 12 men to the most desperate conditions, I knew that terror and doom must have ridden beside them on their played-out horses. But the diary is, for the most part, laconic about their hardships. On our own journey, the risks were minimal. A bad dream about creepy gunslingers arriving at our camp in the night bore only the faintest subconscious echo of the real threats that had shadowed travelers in the wilderness in previous centuries. Normally, Spanish expeditions crossing the badlands of the American Southwest, most notably the Jornada del Muerto between El Paso and Santa Fe, a gauntlet that invited attack by Apaches and Comanches, traveled heavily armed. Among the 10 men who set off to the north from Santa Fe in 1776, there were no soldiers. And though Escalante never records what weapons the men carried, the few references to firearms surface only when the starving men used muskets to fell a bison here or celebrate a river crossing there. The journal does not suppress the tribulations the men endured, especially during the second half of the journey. Terrible cold, even in September. Grim trudges across prairies devoid of firewood or water, confusion in canyons and forests as the men suspect they're lost. These and other depredations come to vivid life in the pages of the journal. But against the threat of even more insidious dangers, Escalante wore a suit of invisible armor, his faith. In 1775, the 25-year-old priest was assigned to the pueblo of Zuni, far to the southwest of Santa Fe, in historian John Kessel's pithy phrase, to Spanish minds the Siberia of New Mexico. Yet he decided, in the hope of making conversions among an even more remote community of natives, to make a journey to Hopi, 130 miles farther west. Escalante's mission was an utter failure. Not a single Indian was persuaded by his earnest sermons, translated by a local, to give up his allegiance to Massau and the Kachinas and become a Christian. As he prepared to return to Zuni, a sympathetic Hopi told Escalante that he had overheard a group of Navajos plotting to lie in wait along the trail to ambush and massacre his small party. Escalante was unfazed. I replied that I was very grateful to him for the warning, but that he was to tell them from me that even all of them were too few to carry out their intention, that if they liked, they might seek the aid of other tribes, but even if many went forth, they would have an exceedingly costly trial of their weakness and my safeguard. The informant, thinking that Escalante had misunderstood the Navajo threat or given no credence to his words, called upon other Hopi to witness his warning. The friar doubled down, saying that, though I believed him, I was not worried, nor should he be, because I trusted in God, who is infinitely more powerful than all the men there ever were, are, or will be. Spain's exploration of what would become the western United States began with Coronado's Entrada from 1540 to 1542. It is a measure of just how ambitious the conquistadors were, how hungry for new land, that only 19 years after Cortés had completed his astonishing conquest of the Aztec Empire centered around Tenochtitlan, today's Mexico City, the Spaniards were pushing the borders of terra incognita more than 1,000 miles to the northwest. Coronado's adventure was launched in response to one of the strangest and most unlikely journeys ever accomplished by Europeans in the New World. One day in 1536, 4 Spaniards stumbled into the colonial outpost of Culiacan in today's Mexican state of Sinaloa. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 weary companions were the sole survivors of an expedition of some 600 men that had come to grief along the west coast of Florida in 1528. For 8 years, the 4 survivors had wandered among Indian tribes, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as shamans revered for their magical gifts, as they made their way across 2,500 miles of unmapped terrain from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. Although at first they were suspected of making up their outlandish tale, the 4 vagabonds brought electrifying news of unknown lands and tribes that whetted the Spanish imagination. Driven by an unquenchable thirst for gold and silver, but also by a zeal to convert pagans to the true faith, the governors of New Spain sent out a scouting mission in 1539. The party was led by a Franciscan, Fray Marcos de Niza, a missionary model for Domínguez and Escalante 2.5 centuries later, and guided by Esteban, a Moor from North Africa, originally a Spanish slave, who had been one of Cabeza de Vaca's companions on that epic journey of survival. All across the wilderness the 4 refugees traversed, Esteban spurred bewildered curiosity among the Indians. Who was he, this brown-skinned stranger traveling with his white-skinned comrades, speaking the same strange tongue as they did? The Moor had a remarkable gift for picking up native languages, so during their desperate journey, it was he who best communicated with the Indians. By some he was treated as a servant to be starved and tormented, while to others he was a healer with occult and wondrous powers. In 1539, his success among the savages must have gone to Esteban's head. Impetuously he rode several days ahead of the cautious priest and the main party, and while he announced the coming of white men who would instruct the natives about things divine, he also demanded tribute in the form of turquoise and women. Somewhere in what is today the greater Southwest, Esteban rubbed his temporary hosts the wrong way. In the words of historian Andrés Reséndez, those Indians deliberated for 3 days about what to do and finally chose to kill him. Despite this setback, Fray Marcos de Niza rode in sight of some large native settlement, where he later claimed to have seen from afar buildings made of gold, festooned with precious jewels. This doubtful sighting reinforced the enduring legend of the 7 cities of Cibola, or the 7 cities of gold. A persistent oral tradition has it that Esteban's fatal encounter occurred at the New Mexico pueblo of Zuni, though some scholars doubt the connection. On a warm September day in 2002, a Zuni woman named Lina Tsethlikai guided me to Hawiku, the village in which, if the oral tradition has it right, Esteban met his doom. Though the site lies in ruins today, in the 16th century it was one of 6 villages that made up the prosperous pueblo of Zuni. No one knows how long those people have dwelled in their current location, but the fact that the Zuni language is an isolate, a tongue related to no other language anywhere in the world, suggests a geographic stability lasting 8,000 years or longer. With Tsethlikai, I strolled across the furrows and swales of the ruin, which is normally off-limits to Anglos. The ground was covered with polychrome potsherds, and scores of crumbling walls, the purplish building stones scattered on either side, outlined the layout of the ancient town. The site lay open to the distant horizon on the southwest, the direction from which the Spaniards would have come. I asked Tsethlikai what had happened here in 1539. As a young girl, she had been told the story by her father. At first the Zuni thought he was a great man, she said. They liked the parrot feather plumes that he had. They thought he must be an important man. But Esteban came to look around and see what was here. He started demanding food and shelter. Then he started wanting our women. That's why the Zunis got mad and killed him. The expedition led by Coronado amounted to a virtual army, as 400 armed men, more than 1,300 Indian allies, and 4 Franciscan priests, driving hundreds of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, marched slowly north beyond Culiacan toward the rumored lands in the north. In July 1540, the forces reached Hawiku. When the Zuni forbade entry into the pueblo, Coronado attacked, in only days completing what he grandiosely called the conquest of Cibola. But the leader was disgusted to discover that Marcos de Niza's golden walls were made of mud and stones. During the next 2 years, Coronado ranged all over what would become New Mexico, frustrated again and again in his search for gold and silver. When Puebloans offered him their most precious substance, turquoise, he redoubled his disgust. In 1541, an Indian whom the Spaniards called the Turk filled Coronado's ears with honeyed tales of a land called Quivira, far to the east, where the chief drank from golden cups hanging from trees. It is now clear that Puebloans invented Quivira in hopes of luring the despotic conquistador far away from their homeland. With the Turk as his guide, Coronado spent months marching across the Texas Panhandle and western Kansas, discovering instead of fabled Quivira only a succession of wretched, nearly naked tribes. When at last he gave up the eastern quest, Coronado ordered the Turk strangled. Among the expedition's dubious achievements was the European discovery of the Grand Canyon, when a lieutenant, Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, guided by Hopi men, came to the south rim as he sought a route westward to the Pacific. At first glance, Cardenas completely misjudged the size of the colossal gorge. Guessing that the river threading the canyon bends below was only waist or shoulder deep, he sent several men out to scout, expecting their return in hours. When they regained the rim after 3 days, exhausted, their clothes torn to shreds, with the news that the great river was unfordable, an exasperated Cardenas gave up his mission. A trenchant footnote to the Spanish discovery of the Grand Canyon: 317 years would elapse before the first Anglo-American reached the edge of the Great Abyss. In 1857, in the vicinity of today's Hualapai Reservation, U.S. Army Lieutenant Joseph Ives gazed down at the river and the canyon below before turning back in disgust as vehement as that of his Spanish predecessor. Wrote Ives in his government report, "Ours has been the first, and will doubtless be the last, party of whites to visit this profitless locality." Coronado's long foray through New Mexico decimated the native populations. In the Tewex War, the Spaniards wiped out a whole complex of Pueblo villages, killing hundreds of inhabitants. Despite the conquistador's savagery, his expedition was a monumental campaign of exploration and discovery. Historians today devote whole conferences to figuring out just what Coronado did and where he went. But on its return to Mexico City, the expedition was castigated as an expensive failure. For his pains, Coronado suffered bankruptcy and prosecution by the government for war crimes. Though he was acquitted, he never recovered from injuries suffered on the expedition and died in infamy in 1554. In the aftermath of Coronado, an ambivalence about New Mexico lingered for decades. Not until 1582 did an expedition set out with the aim of turning that northern hinterland into a colony. The first 5 such attempts came nowhere near success. The last and most feckless of them ended pathetically out on the eastern plains after one of its 2 leaders stabbed the other to death, prompting Indians to wipe out the whole party. It was not until 1598, 56 years after Coronado limped back to Mexico City, that an army under Don Juan de Oñate rode up the Rio Grande and forced one pueblo after another to succumb to Spanish rule. Oñate was at least as merciless and violent a conquistador as Coronado. His advent is seared into the collective memory of Acoma Pueblo. In December, the proud residents of its mesa-top redoubt resisted the attack of Oñate's lieutenant, killing him and 10 of his soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. A month later, Oñate exacted his revenge. With a force of 70 armed and mounted men, He overcame the defenses of the Pueblo fortress and set fire to the buildings. Between 600 and 800 Acomans, men, women, and children, died. Even this rout was not punishment enough to tame Oñate's rage. After the battle, he decreed that every Acoma man over the age of 25 should have his right foot cut off, at the onset of a sentence of 20 years of slavery. Women older than 12 and all the younger men likewise were to serve for 2 decades as slaves. Only girls and boys younger than 12 were spared, assigned to become servants in Spanish households. At least 60 Acoma girls ended up as slaves in Mexico, torn for the rest of their lives from their families. Oñate's conquest launched 8 decades of colonial bondage for New Mexico's Puebloans. From Coronado onward, the Spanish distinguished between 2 distinct species of natives in this new land. The Indios de Pueblos claimed a higher rung on the ladder of presumed ascent toward civilization, for in building permanent settlements, pueblos, or towns of stone and mortar, they demonstrated a nascent aptitude for humanity. As such, they were viable candidates for conversion to the Catholic Church. Nomads, such as Utes, Apaches, Navajos, and Comanches, on the other hand, were Indios barbaros, beyond hope of salvation, if indeed they even possessed souls, to be eliminated rather than brought into the Catholic fold. Under Oñate's rule, New Mexico imposed a pair of legal obligations on the Puebloans that often reduced their existence to a fight for survival. Encomienda entitled each Spanish colonist to exact a tribute from a designated number of Indians in the form of goods, usually the staple crop of maize, corn, or the hides of animals. Repartimiento granted the colonists a similar tribute in the form of unpaid labor. These twin burdens were not the invention of Oñate. They sprang from a tradition dating back even before the discovery of the New World, to Hispanic dominion over the Moors. In exchange for these subjugations, the Spaniards promised the Puebloans protection against nomad raiders, but so small were the number of colonists in and around Santa Fe, so poorly armed and trained, that Comanche and Apache attacks still took their regular toll. From the founding of the new colony through the first 80 years of the 17th century, it was Franciscan friars, rather than Jesuits or Dominicans, who fulfilled the divine mandate to bring the word of God into the hearts and minds of natives who for centuries had gathered in their kivas and plazas to worship foolish idols and practice their hideous rites. From the start, the Puebloans were mystified and misled by the twin rule of church and state, for it was not at all clear whether the demands of the colony's governor and soldiers were to be obeyed or the exhortations of the priests. Despite the apparent smoothness of Oñate's conquest, New Mexico got off to a bad start. An air of demoralization quickly set in among the ranks of new settlers. Not only was there no gold or silver to be mined in the hills rising on either side of the Rio Grande, but crops and livestock suffered under the fickle climate of this arid land. Near starvation became the normal state of existence for the Indians and even for the poorer colonists, many of whom gave up and returned to the more fruitful colonies to the south. By 1608, the Spanish population of New Mexico had dwindled to about 200. In that year, one of the great historical ironies in the long pageant of European subjugation of the tribes of North America unfolded. Chastened by the dismal reports of life in New Mexico that messengers carried south to the capital, in 1608, the Viceroy in Mexico City sent a report to the Council of the Indies in Madrid summing up conditions in the new colony. On September 13th, that body formally recommended the immediate and complete abandonment of Nuevo Mexico. How different the history of the American Southwest would have been had the Council's recommendation been carried out. Might the first invaders to disturb the balance of power and territory among the many tribes who roamed and settled the canyons, plains, and mountains between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River have been the lawless, mostly illiterate mountain men of the 1820s and 30s? It was not to be. Alarmed by the Council's declaration, the Franciscan friars of New Mexico thwarted the abandonment. A single fact-finding priest, Fray Lázaro Jiménez, returned to Mexico City in December 1608, claiming that no fewer than 7,000 Indians had been converted and baptized in the short decade of Spanish rule.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?